The Guardian's selective depth. Where was this editorial from 2015 to 2025? An editorial by Professor Wall Street. The Trinidad Guardian's editorial titled T&T's Government is completely out of its depth represents the latest installment in what has become a transparent and relentless campaign of bias against Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessa's administration. The editorial's breathless alarm about geopolitical complexity, its hyperbolic characterization of radar installation as national catastrophe, and its apocalyptic predictions of Trinidad and Tobago caught in superpower conflicts would be almost amusing if they weren't so transparently hypocritical. The fundamental question the Guardian refused to address is simple. Where was this editorial vigilance from 2015 until April 28, 2025? Where were the alarmed editorials about the PNM government's geopolitical entanglements? Where were the concerns about Trinidad and Tobago being pawns in geopolitical dances when the PNM signed the very status of forces agreement that enables current U.S. military cooperation? The answer is obvious and damning. The Guardian remained conspicuously, deliberately silent. No editorials warning about geopolitical depths, no alarm about regional tensions, no suggestions that the PNM government was completely out of its depth. The newspaper that now discovers existential threats in radar installations couldn't find words to critique a decade of PNM foreign policy failures. This selective editorial vigilance, silent during 10 years of PNM governance, hyperactive during months of UNC administration, exposes the Guardian not as independent Fortis State watchdog, but as partisan political actor whose editorial positions shift based on which party governs rather than on consistent principles or actual security concerns. Here are 10 reasons why the Fortis State continues its transparent campaign against the UNC government. 1. The decade of silence, 2015 to 2025. The most damning indictment of the Guardian's editorial is what the newspaper didn't write from 2015 to 2025. During the PNM's decade in power, the Guardian produced virtually no editorials expressing alarm about Trinidad and Tobago's geopolitical positioning, the status of forces agreement signed with the United States, regional tensions with Venezuela, drug trafficking cooperation with American forces, military equipment or personnel presence, complex foreign policy decisions. Yet within months of the UNC taking office, the Guardian suddenly discovers that Trinidad and Tobago faces geopolitical complexity requiring editorial alarm. This government is completely out of its depth, the newspaper proclaims, despite inheriting the very agreements, relationships, and strategic positioning established by the PNM. This selective concern destroys the Guardian's credibility. If Trinidad and Tobago's geopolitical situation is so perilous, why did the Guardian remain silent for 10 years while the PNM established the very framework now being criticized? The obvious answer: the Guardian applies different editorial standards based on which party governs. 2. The lie mischaracterization. The Guardian's editorial begins with inflammatory language. The admission by Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessa that she lied to the nation about the U.S. government's surreptitious installation of a radar system. This characterization is deliberately dishonest. The Prime Minister never admitted lying. She explained that operational security requirements necessitated graduated disclosure as the installation progressed. This is standard practice in military operations worldwide, not dishonesty. By framing operational security as lying, the Guardian reveals its editorial agenda. transforming legitimate security protocols into scandals through inflammatory language. This isn't journalism, it's political attack disguised as editorial concern. The newspaper that should understand the difference between operational security and dishonesty deliberately conflates them to damage the Prime Minister's credibility.
3. Speculative fear-mongering about radar capabilities. The Guardian's editorial descends into wild speculation about radar capabilities. Can it detect military equipment on the ground in Venezuela, track its movement, or send information to the U.S. Southern Command to inflict damage on Venezuelan forces? This represents irresponsible fear-mongering based on zero evidence. The Guardian has no information about the radar system's actual capabilities, operational parameters, or intended use. Yet the editorial presents worst-case speculative scenarios as if they were established facts requiring urgent public alarm. This journalistic malpractice, presenting speculation as fact to generate fear, violates basic editorial standards. Responsible journalism distinguishes between what's known, what's suspected, and what's purely speculative. The Guardian deliberately blurs these distinctions to manufacture crisis where none has been demonstrated. 4. Ignoring that P&M signed a foundational agreement. Perhaps most hypocritical is the Guardian's failure to acknowledge that the P&M government signed the Status of Forces Agreement enabling current U.S. military cooperation. The legal framework, strategic relationship, and operational protocols all originated under P&M governance. Yet the Guardian now discovers these arrangements are evidence the UNC is out of its depth.
If these agreements are so problematic, why didn't the Guardian criticize them when the P&M signed them? If Trinidad and Tobago's geopolitical positioning is so perilous, why wasn't the newspaper alarmed when the P&M established that positioning? The answer exposes the Guardian's partisan double standards. The same agreements are unproblematic when signed by the P&M, but evidence of incompetence when implemented by the UNC. This isn't consistent editorial principle, it's transparent political bias. 5. The pawns in geopolitical dance, melodrama. The Guardian's editorial reaches peak melodrama, claiming Trinidad and Tobago has become mere pawns in this geopolitical dance with little wiggle room to emerge unscathed should hostilities erupt. This apocalyptic language vastly overstates both Trinidad and Tobago's strategic importance and the actual regional security situation. Small nations always navigate relationships with larger powers. This represents normal international relations, not unprecedented catastrophe. The Guardian's suggestion that radar installation in Tobago will trigger U.S.-Venezuela conflict, with Trinidad and Tobago caught in the crossfire, represents fear-mongering disconnected from actual geopolitical analysis. The newspaper that should provide sober assessment instead produces dramatic scenarios designed to generate alarm rather than inform understanding.
6. Selective concern about Venezuelan relations.
The Guardian expresses sudden concern about Trinidad and Tobago being caught in a geopolitical contest between the United States and Venezuela. But where was this concern during the P&M's decade in power when Venezuela placed bounties on its own officials? The U.S. imposed comprehensive sanctions. Regional tensions steadily increased. The Dragon gas deal collapsed. Trinidad and Tobago's relationship with Venezuela deteriorated. The Guardian remained editorially silent, while the P&M presided over declining Venezuelan relations and increasing regional tensions. Now, when the UNC attempts to resurrect the Dragon deal and manage complex U.S.-Venezuela dynamics, The Guardian discovers geopolitical peril. This selective concern reveals that the Guardian's editorial position isn't driven by consistent analysis of Trinidad and Tobago's strategic interests, but by which party is attempting to manage those interests. 7. Ignoring successful regional navigation. The Guardian's editorial assumes the UNC government cannot successfully navigate regional complexities, ignoring that Prime Minister Persad Bissessar has already demonstrated sophisticated diplomatic management. She has maintained productive relationships with both the US and Venezuela, resurrected the Dragon gas deal that collapsed under the PNM, secured US cooperation on security matters, positioned Trinidad and Tobago as regional energy hub, balanced competing interests while protecting national sovereignty. Rather than acknowledging this successful navigation, the Guardian simply assumes failure and incompetence. This reveals editorial agenda rather than fair assessment. The newspaper has predetermined that the UNC is out of its depth, regardless of actual diplomatic achievements. 8. The Farley-Augustin deflection. The Guardian bizarrely critiques Chief Secretary Farley-Augustin for distancing himself from this geopolitical tango after previously insisting Tobago must have a major say in everything affecting Tobago. This represents transparent attempt to manufacture internal government conflict where none exists. Augustin's measured response to a sensitive security matter doesn't constitute distancing. It represents appropriate deference to national government on national security issues. The Guardian's attempt to create controversy by suggesting Augustin should be more publicly involved in sensitive security operations shows a newspaper more interested in generating political drama than understanding appropriate governmental roles in security matters. 9. Ignoring the actual drug trafficking threat. Most tellingly, the Guardian's editorial dismisses the stated purpose of the radar installation, detecting drug trafficking vessels, as insufficient justification. The newspaper speculates about military targeting capabilities while minimizing the very real immediate threat that narco-trafficking poses to Trinidad and Tobago. Drug trafficking organizations operate sophisticated supply chains through Caribbean waters, bringing violence, corruption, and social destruction to the region. Detecting and interdicting these operations represents legitimate, urgent national security interests. Yet the Guardian treats this as cover story for imagined military provocations. This dismissal of actual documented threats in favor of speculative worst-case scenarios shows editorial judgment divorced from Trinidad and Tobago's real security challenges. The Guardian is more concerned with manufacturing controversy about hypothetical military scenarios than addressing the concrete drug trafficking crisis affecting citizens daily. 10. The fundamental fourth estate betrayal. Most damaging is what the Guardian's editorial reveals about the newspaper's understanding of fourth estate responsibility. Independent media serves democracy by holding all governments accountable with consistent standards, scrutinizing all equally, praising success and criticizing failure regardless of party. The Guardian's decade of silence, followed by months of alarm, demonstrates abandoned independence for partisan positioning. The newspaper that should apply consistent standards instead functions as selective critic, silent when the PNM governs, alarmed when the UNC administers. This destroys credibility and betrays democratic responsibility. When citizens recognize that major newspapers apply different standards based on which party governs, they correctly conclude media cannot be trusted as independent arbiters. This erodes the Fourth Estate's essential democratic function. The Guardian produced inflammatory rhetoric about lies, apocalyptic scenarios about geopolitical catastrophe, and predetermined conclusions about UNC incompetence, all while ignoring its own decade of editorial silence when the PNM established the very framework now being criticized. The consequences of media bias. When major newspapers like The Guardian abandon consistent standards for partisan agendas, the consequences extend beyond editorial credibility. Public trust erodes. Citizens recognize double standards and dismiss media as unreliable partisan actors rather than independent sources. Democratic discourse suffers. When newspapers model selective criticism rather than consistent principle, they encourage the same behavior throughout political culture. Government accountability weakens. Officials correctly dismiss criticism as partisan positioning rather than legitimate concern when newspapers apply different standards to different administrations. Fourth Estate authority collapses. Newspapers that function as partisan actors lose the credibility necessary to influence policy or hold power accountable. In conclusion, the Guardian's lost credibility. The Trinidad Guardian's editorial claiming the UNC government is completely out of its depth would be compelling if the newspaper had applied similar scrutiny to the PNM government that signed the agreements now being criticized. If the Guardian had expressed similar alarm about geopolitical complexity during the decade when the PNM established Trinidad and Tobago's current strategic positioning. If the newspaper had distinguished between what's known and what's speculative. If it had acknowledged legitimate security threats rather than dismissing them as cover stories. But the Guardian did none of these things. Instead, the newspaper remained silent for 10 years while the PNM governed, then discovered existential crises within months of the UNC taking office. This selective vigilance destroys credibility and exposes transparent partisan bias. The question isn't whether the UNC government is perfectly managing complex geopolitical relationships. No government does. The question is whether the Guardian applies consistent editorial standards or reserves its alarm exclusively for governments it opposes. The answer is obvious from the newspaper's decade of silence, followed by months of hyperventilation. The Guardian, that couldn't find words to critique PNM foreign policy for 10 years, now produces breathless editorials about the UNC being out of its depth, while managing the very arrangements the PNM established. This isn't Fourth Estate independence. It's partisan political positioning disguised as editorial principle. It's selective outrage masquerading as security concern. It's hypocrisy so transparent that even casual observers recognize the Guardian has abandoned journalistic standards for political advocacy. Trinidad and Tobago deserves better from its Fourth Estate. Citizens deserve newspapers that apply consistent standards regardless of which party governs. They deserve media that distinguishes between operational security and dishonesty, between legitimate threats and speculative fears, between inherited arrangements and new policies. Until the Guardian demonstrates it can critique all governments with equal vigor, until it acknowledges its decade of silence, while the PNM established current geopolitical arrangements, until it applies the same standards to all parties, the newspaper's editorials deserve recognition for what they are. Partisan attacks masquerading as principled concern. The UNC government may indeed face challenges navigating complex regional dynamics. But the Guardian's editorial reveals more about the newspaper's partisan agenda than about the government's actual capabilities. When your decade of silence is followed by months of alarm, when you apply different standards based on which party governs, when you dismiss legitimate threats while speculating about hypothetical catastrophes, you've lost credibility as independent fourth estate watchdog. The Guardian isn't out of its depth. It's abandoned depth entirely for shallow partisan positioning that serves political agenda rather than democratic discourse or citizen understanding.